Hi, I know I promised that my next video would be on puberty blockers, and it will, the next one, which I intend to upload very soon after this impromptu reaction to the very same troll I talked about in my last video, to which he has posted this response. Well, maybe I'm biased, but I found this video less condescending than normal. Oh, I'm sorry. My bad, as they say. It certainly wasn't my intention not to be condescending, Ron, because from my perspective, people who say unutterably stupid things that reveal a willful ignorance and closed-mindedness on their part deserve all the condescension that I can muster. I do hope that I can make up for it this time. In fact, I hope I already have. The entire conflict is exactly as Maria points out when she talks about how she doesn't deny appropriate medical care. She is correct to say that she and I disagree on what counts as appropriate medical care, and of course the comments she's responding to were me trying to show her position in a negative light. But that's my rebuttal to basically all of her points. She can roll her eyes and say it is deluded to think that trans women in women's spaces is safe and appropriate, but I disagree. See, how can you possibly disagree with countless news reports showing that men who call themselves trans women or just women are no safer for women to be around than men who don't claim a trans identity? I mean, where does this idea that Ron is so blindly attached to come from? Saying that only trans-identifying men are safe to be around is demonstrably untrue. So, what's Maria's evidence that some trans women are sex predators? Well, yeah, but let me add something that I omitted from the last video because I have already said it numerous times and I am fed up with constantly having to defend a position based on a demonstrable truth and getting diverted from making the equally important point that it's not just about physical safety, it's also about our feelings. Women are human. A great many are survivors of abusive behaviours by men. Why is it so hard to understand why we feel as we do? How come it's so easy to dismiss our feelings while kowtowing to those of men? Assuming Ron Wood is indeed a man, and his total disregard for women suggests to me that he is, he will surely have in his life at least some women that he cares about, but just not enough to recognise their humanity, it seems. This is one of the things that most surprises me about the gender cult. How many times do we hear or read warnings that somebody might make trans-identifying people feel unsafe by the presence or words of women standing for women? But the same people just expect women who feel uncomfortable or vulnerable, frightened by the presence of a male person to just put up and shut the F up. I'm getting a sense of deja vu. I'm sure I've said all of this stuff before, about 1 million times probably. Anyway, let's see what fantastic insight Ron can offer us in defence of his position of disagreeing that trans-identifying men should stay out of women's spaces. Some women are sex predators. Oh my God, this is what I mean when I refer to unbelievable stupidity and willful ignorance. I dealt with this crap in the last video in my Awful Arguments by Trans Activists series. The video is entitled Predatory Women. Check it out. I'm not saying that no women ever commit sex offences, but not only are they very rare, but they are of a different nature. I don't expect to spell out how women and men behave differently and how male and female sexuality differ, and I'm not here to provide sex education anyway. Knowing the proportions, I think, is extremely relevant to determining policies about whether to include trans women in safe spaces. Is that data available? It isn't relevant at all because no males should be in female spaces simply by virtue of the fact that they are male, but I'll provide some data anyway since you can't manage to find it by yourself. First, be aware that even though females are even more than half the population, female prisoners comprise fewer than 5% of the total prison population in the UK. A few years ago, the Ministry of Justice estimated that the number of transgender inmates totalled 125 and that 60 of them were sex offenders. This is a chart from a House of Commons Justice Committee report on women in prison in England and Wales that was published last year. The figures are from 2019. The dark blue represents male prisoners, the light blue represent female prisoners, and on the left you can see what they were convicted for. At the top are violent offences, second one down are sexual offences, which may of course also be violent. Of those convicted of sex offences, 98% were men, 2% were women, which was about 125 incarcerated women at the time. Almost all women convicted of sex offences are accomplices of male sex offenders. They don't usually act alone or lead in the offence. You could say that they are the worst kind of handmaids. As for trans-identifying men, I will link below to a recent article in Wings Over Scotland which links to various reputable sources and which quotes the most up-to-date figures available. Apparently, fewer people have been sent to prison since the start of the pandemic, and the population of male sex offenders went down by a couple of thousand. That's about 15%, I think. The number of female sex offenders went down from 125 to 110. That's 12%. The number of trans-identifying male sex offenders went up by over 50% from 60 to 92, of which 5 were serving their sentences in the female estate. Outrageous. Next. As much as she shows a handful of trans-identifying male sexual predators, anecdotes are anecdotes. Right, this is just Ron trolling again. What are we to make of such a daft comment? The number of sex offenders I showed was many more than a handful, and they are just a tiny fraction of the total number of pervy, trans-identifying men who get sexual gratification from hurting women and children. And remember, I only show examples in the English language from English-speaking countries. There are other populations of trans-identifying abusers that we don't get to hear about. And yes, anecdotes are anecdotes, and police reports, court reports, prison reports and reports of governmental inquiries are what they are too. But you stay warm and snug in your place of frantic denial. Maria knows that sex and gender are defined differently by me and her other opposition on this topic. Well, actually, I don't know how Ron defines gender. I'm not sure that I've ever seen him do it. She seems to imply that the majority of trans people think they can or have actually changed their sex. On the contrary, I argue that they know that they can't change their sex, and the point that Ron fails to grasp this time is that the cultists, including Ron, conflate sex and gender in a bait-and-switch kind of way. The very phrase assigned male or female at birth is a reflection of the dishonesty that permeates the ideology. They might admit to, as they put it, being assigned male at birth, but they claim that woman is their gender without being able to explain what they mean by it, nor do they address the wider question of why so many carry out male typical behaviours and then use their proclaimed gender as a means to demand access to women's sex-based rights and protections. They are asking to be respected and treated as the gender to which they identify, if any. Well, some are, but many others, and I believe they are the majority these days, are demanding and trying to bully people into allowing them access to our spaces, sports and occupations, which is what they mean by respecting their gender. They also recognise that it is Maria's right to refuse to be respectful. No, they don't recognise that right. That is why they target women's meetings and individual women and a few men with threats, abuse, cancelling, no platforming, vandalism and violence. She says that she doesn't deny trans identity, but that is only because, once again, she and I disagree on the definition of trans identity. She thinks it is a symptom of mental illness, and I more directly compare it to sexual orientation. Certainly different, but a valid variation in human expression. Yeah, a lot of people compare it to sexual orientation, much to the annoyance of many gay people. I have dealt with that aspect numerous times already. I'll just show one argument again from my Awful Argument series and the video entitled Homophobia Repurposed. The right to be free to love or have sex with someone of the same sex doesn't have an impact on anyone else's rights. In campaigning against discrimination against gay people, gay men and lesbians didn't try to do anything that could potentially impact the psychological and emotional well-being of anyone else, like demand access to spaces reserved for people of the other sex. They didn't demand to compete in sports events of the other sex, thereby cheating people out of their rightful places in sports teams and medals tables. They didn't try to force people to go along with any pretense or change their language to stop people talking about things to do with biological sex, like menstruation, pregnancy, and breastfeeding. They didn't accuse people who didn't want to sleep with them of being exclusionary or homophobic. They weren't undermining feminist campaigns against rigid, backward stereotypes by adopting them themselves. They weren't in the business of trying to get people who disagreed with them sacked from their jobs. They weren't asking for or promoting puberty blockers, binders, cross-sex hormones, or other medical interventions of uncertain safety on perfectly healthy bodies. And they didn't promote violence and sexual assault against women who disagreed with them. Okay, I'm going to deal with puberty blockers in the next video, so I'll skip that bit. Next. And while I reference Nazis, I'm not comparing, except at the most pedantic level, whatever that means, Maria and people with her beliefs to Nazis. Yes, you are. Of all the causes you could have chosen that people do protest against, from Brexit to blood sports to enforced anti-COVID measures, you chose Nazis for a reason. It is one of your cult's most oft used and desperate strategies to get that association planted in people's minds. I was just suggesting that angry protesting is not, in and of itself, unexpected or terrible. Nobody is saying it is, and you know that. People, who include women, by the way, have the right to protest. We also have the right to speak and the right to be heard, but the trans cult repeatedly try to deprive us of those rights because they have the minds of fascist thugs. They are no better. It depends on what you're protesting. The videos she shows include anger and taunts. These are protected free speech, even if I wouldn't do them. The videos I show, including the clips of those savages at Bristol that I showed in the last video, were public order offences. In the video they originally appeared in the video about being censored by Patreon, which Ron didn't even watch, I showed an article by a former commissioner of police saying there was a raft of legislation that could have been used to stop them screaming and drowning out our voices, because that is my objection. They can abuse us to their heart's content. It makes no difference to the truth of what we are saying and just shows them in their true colours, as people unable to defeat us with rational arguments. But by allowing them to get so close and to shout over us, the police were showing their true colours. As I've said before, they are the trans cult's goon squad. Having said that, it was good to hear that the police in Newcastle at Kelly J. Keen's gig on Sunday.
Here we go, it's the time for that angry man to shout at women.
Did a much better job at keeping the pond life far enough away to at least let those who wanted to hear the speakers hear them, even though the police ultimately failed to prevent a woman being knocked to the ground by one of the pond life. It always feels that that there is violence simmering very close to the surface with these people, and inevitably it occasionally breaks through. How long before somebody gets seriously hurt? Finally, so it all comes back to the harms analysis in the end. Which is worse for the majority of people? Transgender acceptance or trans exclusion, meaning policies that treat trans people as their assigned sex, which is not actually exclusion. There's another difference of opinion, fancy that. I've not seen a particular strong argument that trans acceptance is causing more harm, but again, Maria will disagree. Well, that's because of your willful refusal to recognise the hurt and harms being caused. As we've seen, you are in denial. You are trying to minimise the problem, and I'm sure I'm not the only one wondering why you are so desperate to do so. That's the nature of debate. Yeah, sure it is. Perhaps one day you will learn how to do it properly and argue for your position using reason and evidence. Back soon. Thanks for watching. Bye.